Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about why I no longer attend the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And there are a couple of reasons. It wasn't just one thing that caused me to stop attending. But to start off with, I'm going to explain some of the issues that I had with the Book of Mormon specifically. And the reason that it was a problem that I had issues with the Book of Mormon itself was because, as you'll know if you are or were a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Book of Mormon is used as a sort of cure-all for any doubts. So if you have any doubts about anything whatsoever in the church or anything connected with the church, then all you're supposed to do is read the Book of Mormon and pray about it. And assuming you can get confident that the Book of Mormon is true, well, then everything else must automatically be true. Now, there are problems with that line of reasoning, but that is the line of reasoning that the church promotes. And so nobody really sits back and thinks, well, what will happen if somebody actually has doubts regarding the Book of Mormon? At least that's how it seemed to me. And the reason it seems that way to me is because when I actually addressed this and wrote down as part of my concerns anonymously in Relief Society that I had doubts about the scriptures specifically, and that reading the scriptures seemed to make those doubts worse, that was never addressed. In the Relief Society, they addressed the main concern, which seemed to be self-esteem issues, but there was not anyone who addressed what I was supposed to do, not knowing how to get rid of my doubts about the scriptures. But to get into what those doubts were specifically, they all had to do with the Lamanites. Now, I know that there are a lot of other things that I could have had doubts about that I knew could cause doubts, but what really caused doubts for me was the way the Lamanites were portrayed. And this is because when I was a kid, it all seemed to make sense. When I was a kid, I felt like the Lamanites were portrayed exactly like Native Americans would be portrayed, which made perfect sense since they were supposed to be the ancestors of the Native Americans. But then, as I got older, it just seemed more and more as if they were portraying a caricature of the Native Americans rather than what the Native Americans would have actually been like, even at that time. Plus the fact, of course, that societies change over time, and it just seemed to me that the Lamanites were being portrayed in a way that suggested that they had not changed very much. One example of this is the fact that the Lamanites believed in the Great Spirit, for example. And this was odd to me because at the point where the Great Spirit is referenced in the Book of Mormon, that's prior to a period of time where supposedly all the Nephites and the Lamanites believed in Jesus Christ. And then so somehow the Lamanites went back to believing in the Great Spirit afterward, and that bothered me. And then there were just verses here and there about the behavior of the Lamanites that would really strike me as a very troubling portrayal of a society that caused me to have serious doubts about the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. And just an example of one of those verses is in Enos, verse 20, where it says, "And I bear record that the people of Nephi did seek diligently to restore the Lamanites unto the true faith in God. But our labors were vain, their hatred was fixed, and they were led by their evil nature, that they became wild and ferocious and a bloodthirsty people, full of idolatry and filthiness, feeding upon beasts of prey, dwelling in tents, and wandering about in the wilderness with a short skin girdle about their loins and their heads shaven. And their skill was in the bow and in the scimitar and in the axe. And many of them did eat nothing save it was raw meat, and they were continually seeking to destroy us." And so, when I would read verses like that, that would just remind me of all my doubts that I had about the Lamanites specifically. And that would cause me to stress out. There was also a chapter in Alma chapter 3, where more than half of the chapter is describing the supposed curse that the Lamanites brought upon themselves. And the curse, of course, is having darker skin, being marked by having darker skin. And that was something that troubled me. Now, when I was a kid, that didn't bother me so much. And then later, as I was older, I listened to apologetics videos where they said, well, it's not really that their skin was darker, it's that that was some sort of a Hebrew metaphor for their spirits being more downcast. But reading the Book of Mormon, it sure doesn't sound like it's a metaphor for anything. It really does sound to me as if they are talking about their skin actually being darker. And I just don't see that there's a reason to read it differently. Unless, of course, you are actively trying to preserve faith in something that you couldn't otherwise. But when it comes to these concerns that I had about the Book of Mormon, I had those concerns for years, and they didn't cause me to leave the church in and of themselves. Although they did stress me out and cause me to treat the Book of Mormon differently. When I was on my mission, I didn't read it as much as I would have if I was completely comfortable with it. I read one chapter a day, like I figured I was supposed to, but I didn't read more of it than that. And that was because there were things in the Book of Mormon that were already bothering me. And then after my mission, I went through a period of time where I just listened to the Book of Mormon in Spanish using the Gospel Library app, because when I listened to it in Spanish, I pretty much knew what was going on because I had read it so many times in English, but I didn't have that same close connection with the words, and so it didn't bother me as much when these things that bothered me when I read the English version would come up. And so that was one of the things I did for a while. But what really instigated my decision not to attend the church anymore was that in 2018 I had a manic episode. And as part of that manic episode, I had a lot of spiritual experiences that turned out to be based just on the mania. And at that point, I realized that once I had come out of that manic episode, once I recognized it for what it was, and once I started taking meds after finally being diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I realized that all my spiritual experiences were suspect because they all came from my same flawed brain. And so at that point, I stopped taking my spiritual experiences as evidence that the church was true. And when that happened, all the other things that I had been using to kind of bolster up my testimony, despite my doubts of the Book of Mormon, fell through on me. And so for a while after that, I went to church and thought about the good things that would come up through the talks, and would just think positive thoughts to myself about things that were somewhat connected to church that I could relate to. But I really wasn't in a believing position when it came to a lot of things that were talked about in church. And finally, one day, it occurred to me, and this was in early 2019, that the church sort of functions like a club for people who believe the Book of Mormon is true, and I really didn't at that point. And so at that point, I decided that it really didn't make sense for me to keep attending, and so I didn't. And since then, I haven't ever felt the desire to go back. I have attended a sacrament meeting since then. In late 2019, my cousin got back from his mission, and my dad invited me to attend his mission comeback speech in sacrament meeting. And so I went to his ward and listened to him speak. But that experience just kind of drove home for me the fact that I really no longer belong, because I really don't believe the doctrine of the church anymore. And that's what it comes down to. And that's what I would say if anybody asked me, which nobody has, but if anybody from my current ward or from my former YSA ward asked me why I don't attend anymore, I would just say that I don't believe anymore, because that's what it really is. But I hope that for anybody watching this video, this provides some insight into why some people choose not to attend anymore, or choose to actually leave and have their records removed. I know that every individual story is different, and mine is probably somewhat unusual, because I don't think the Book of Mormon is a source of frustration for that many people in the context of all the other things that people could become doubtful or frustrated about within the church. But for me it was, and I hope that my sharing this provides insight for some people, at least. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you for watching. Bye.